Welcome, everyone, to CDO's Magazine series of one-on-one interviews with CDOs, data leaders, and key influencers. I'm your host, Robert Lutton, Vice President, Sandhill Consultants, coming to you today from Toronto, Canada, working with the CDO Magazine. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Brad Reynolds, who is the Senior Vice President of Artificial Intelligence at Expedient. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Robert.
So one of the things you just mentioned just before is as part of the models that you provide both public models and private models, and it brings up a question about building trust and transparency for AI to use. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Because you kind of just glossed over it, but I think that this is a pretty important element for an organization to be able to trust the models and see the transparency. How would Expedient be able to provide that, and what do you do in those cases?
Yeah, so it's a kind of a complicated issue because OpenAI or Google, they can't tell you exactly what's going on under the hood of the models. You kind of see inputs and outputs, and you'll see some horror stories of things that come in and out of the system.
Right.
But there exists a set of closed source models, so those guys, and then a set of open source models that are done by Meta and Mistral and a couple of other folks that have some pretty good ones. And there's thousands and thousands of open source models. So I think from a company's perspective, if you had a completely private model, like you took one of the open source models and fine-tuned it, trained it on your data, that's essentially your piece of software that you're running. You have full control over it. What went into training the initial version of it, you don't know. You get reports from the folks that have trained it about here's the guardrails and controls that we've put in front of it, but it's not perfect right now. So as I say, it's on the messier side. So the way you can kind of mitigate that is if you take a model that's yours, train it on your own data, and host it privately right next to, with the AI models right next to your data, you control who has access to that. It's only people inside of your company. And you can set information from a policy perspective. Hey, if you're using this, realize that this doesn't have these types of guardrails around it based on the people that kind of created the initial model, and it has proprietary information from our company baked into that. Put that hat on when you're using it and just understand that that's what's going on, and know that neither the vendor nor us can completely say 100% that we know exactly what will come out of it at every time. But as an enterprise, you have to kind of minimize that risk. And so self-hosting, model that you understand, self-tune on your own data, and only folks inside of your company having access to it, you've kind of minimized it as much as you possibly can right now. And the reality, like some folks might go, hey, well, let's create a model from scratch where we know where it's possible for you to do that. Only probably accessible to Fortune 500, Fortune 100. And it's very complicated. The folks that are building those models are getting hired by OpenAI for $1 million a year in salary. Right. It'd be very difficult to do that. It's not a good starting point. But the difference between like the self-hosted versus using OpenAI is they're changing this thing of the software. They're changing their software like every day. What happens if it starts behaving in a way you didn't expect? This other piece of software that you've self-hosted, you know what it was yesterday, you know what it is today, right. You've released a new version of it. That control aspect becomes important as you start building it into real enterprise workflows. You need to know what you're dealing with and then minimize the risk with it.
And I think just before the call started, you and I were talking about, ChatGPT 2 months ago. Who knew, whether it was going to be around or not? And when you get that kind of situation, you really have to be careful about getting control on your AI, so that way you don't lose what you've got. Mm-hmm. Moving on to something you just mentioned about, the size of the corporation, things like that. So many organizations may use ChatGPT in their data centers. And so from your point of view, what demands do you see coming down the pipe for AI that is going to be put on the data center infrastructure?
Yeah, so in terms of the demand, it's actually kind of bifurcated. So one side of it will be everybody's talking about the generative AI aspects. And so these are the models that create the text and do the summaries and all that kind of stuff. But there are a ton of models out there that aren't generative. They're doing things like give me a giant amount of text and identify all of the person's names and addresses, pull out structured data from unstructured. So that'd be called named entity recognition. Those are models and extremely valuable type situations for folks. Or, so the notion is the hosting will be like, these models are kind of like the way that we think about compute infrastructure. So we'll be like, hey, I need 20 virtual servers to run this application for me. It's kind of like I need a model that's capable of doing this type of output, and it might need underlying 20 kind of GPU pieces of infrastructure to kind of run that particular thing. So the notion, I think, for enterprises, AI isn't just this generative AI piece, these large language models. In fact, now we're talking small language models. So like, hey, instead of having a generalist that understands everything, what if it really understood Python programming? Or what if inside of Python programming, it really understood some kind of nuance of that? The model starts getting really small, but when you get niche knowledge, to get wide coverage, now you need a bunch of niche experts. So whether that's models that do like named entity recognition, or maybe you had a model for every different type of language that your coders used internally. Because the interesting thing in terms of like, we'll talk to quality output is you can make a small model that's better than GPT-4 right now, because you've essentially made it a PhD in a very narrow discipline. The problem is it becomes less good at almost anything else. So great, if that's the only thing you need to do, then you can have that finely tuned model. But otherwise, you need to kind of accumulate a bunch of different models. So if you're just saying the programming analogy, you'd want to have one for like Go, you'd have one for Python, you'd have one for PHP, you'd have one for C#, and maybe a general coding model over the top of it. And so I see that as the way that things are going, and organizations are going to need to host those models at scale. So it'd be like, hey, I have this kind of coding block of models I need to host. I don't really want to know how many GPUs or how to make that fault tolerant, but I need the output for it. I need my coders to be able to get the code outputs. And because these models might have been tuned on my code, I don't want them hosted out publicly. I want them hosted in a private kind of setting. And you figure out, you provider like an Expedient, figure out how to federate that for me. And so that combo of like the generative aspects, and we'll call it, I think the term might now be classical AI, the stuff that AI has been solving for 20 years really well. It's like, hey, there's no need for different infrastructure. It's just models. Let's figure out how to combine all those together. And then as organizations, especially like the folks that are reading CDO, they're going to understand the data science side of it already. They're going to know those models and how they've applied them before, at least understand what the kind of breadth of capabilities. And if you understand the breadth of capabilities, Gen AI is just maybe 1 out of 20 things that you could be doing on the AI model side that you can explore. But you do need to be able to host that infrastructure at scale.
So just as we come to the end of our time here, I just want to get your opinion that you might want to leave with data leaders as to what steps do you think the data leaders, the CDOs need to take to get their data ready for AI access and use?
Yeah, so this is likely going to expose a bunch of projects that have incurred debt over time with the company. So there's like things that everybody knew that they needed to do, but maybe just didn't have the time for. So I look at this as it will unlock some of those existing projects. So for instance, for the generative side, a lot of times you'll want to, like the knowledge base lookup, you'll want to combine a knowledge base with a generative AI thing so that you could say like, do something, here's a use case, answer an RFP, 180 question RFP, keep looking up in our knowledge base and write the answers and have a human go over it. Really simple use case to kind of go and do. But you need to get that data from the knowledge base into a format that the AI can consume. But even before that, you're going to want to make sure that the knowledge base information that's going in there is the stuff that you would want a human to look up. And so you're going to have some kind of gardening and cleaning of that data that needs to happen that probably you knew about, but you kind of you haven't done. And so what will normally happen with those types of projects is, instead of going through and looking at the 10,000 documents, you'll start picking out the documents you want to be included. And then you create a list of 1,000 or 500 that you can rip through relatively quickly. And then you can get those put into a vector store for kind of AI to access it. So that's probably the early step of kind of cleaning that you need to do. But I think maybe even more important than that is you have to couple the AI to your data. So wherever your data exists now, figure out, how is that data going to have access to AI? What's the latency? Do I have to move it around before it gets access? How do I need to kind of transform or process it? And kind of look at that architecture and then figure out, okay, this is a good scalable architecture for the kind of AI to data coupling long term. Now, what do I need to do to get that architecture implemented? Do I need to put AI gear in a certain place? Do I need to build ETLs and pipelines to do that? Do I need to transform my data? I don't know. You kind of go after that. But the tighter AI and the data are coupled, the more successful you're going to be long term to kind of capitalize on new learnings. So you just get them joined at the hip as soon as possible, would be my thought.
And certainly, Expedient could be able to help organizations through all of these questions. Brad, on behalf of the CDO Magazine, we appreciate your time and feedback. The knowledge that you've got, the knowledge that Expedient has got, it really brings to the forefront a generative AI and what you can do in the organization. So we want to thank you for your time. We hope that we'll get the chance to have you come back and share your knowledge again on harnessing artificial intelligence for the betterment of the organization.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. And for our listeners, please visit cdomagazine.tech for additional interviews. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.